Your four favorites are Rashomon, Bicycle Thieves, The Zone of Interest, and 12 Angry Men. This is a tricky one because Rashomon, Bicycle Thieves, and 12 Angry Men are classics that have been highly influential, so there are a lot of movies I could compare them to, but just because a movie follows Rashomon's storytelling structure or was inspired by 12 Angry Men, that doesn't mean you're going to like it. So I'm tempted to recommend other classics, but then there's no real rhyme or reason for my choices. But sometimes when I recommend a movie based more on vibes than any concrete connections, there ends up being a concrete connection that I didn't even think of. For example, when I was trying to think of movies you might like since you like The Zone of Interest, one of the movies I wrote down was The Act of Killing, for no reason other than it just felt right. But it wasn't until after I wrote it down that I realized this movie inspired one of the most important scenes in The Zone of Interest. But my top choice for you is Harakiri. It's a Japanese samurai film like Rashomon, and the screenplay was written by Shinobu Hashimoto, who co-wrote the screenplay for Rashomon. Like Bicycle Thieves, it depicts a family who's struggling financially. Like The Zone of Interest, it captures how cruel and evil people can be. And like 12 Angry Men, it's about justice. Do the Right Thing, like Rashomon, captures conflicting perspectives surrounding a violent event. Like Bicycle Thieves, it explores working class struggles. Like 12 Angry Men, it takes place on a hot summer day where the heat also serves as a metaphor. And it explores this notion of a collective moral responsibility and scrutinizes the way the system can sometimes fail to provide justice. And like The Zone of Interest, it captures how cruelty can be normalized, and some of the people who participate in systemic harm just kind of ignore, deny, or rationalize their own involvement. The Lives of Others, like Rashomon, explores how the things people observe shape their perception of the truth. Like Bicycle Thieves, the characters are ordinary, vulnerable people whose jobs and livelihoods are at stake. Like The Zone of Interest, it examines authoritarian and oppressive systems and the complicity of the people who enforce them. And like 12 Angry Men, it's about moral courage and ethical decision-making. A Separation, like Rashomon, portrays conflicting accounts of the same events. It depicts class struggles like Bicycle Thieves. Like 12 Angry Men, characters face difficult moral and ethical dilemmas, and the law is involved. Failsafe is from the director of 12 Angry Men and features a couple of the same actors. And the movie is also about moral and ethical dilemmas and decision-making. And like The Zone of Interest, it focuses on the people whose actions cause catastrophic consequences rather than on the victims themselves. I want to recommend The Thin Blue Line because it's an innovative documentary about a murder case that recreates several versions of the crime scene to expose the conflicting testimonies and evidence in order to try and uncover the truth, which reminds me of the way Rashomon portrays conflicting accounts of the same event and this idea of subjective truth. And like 12 Angry Men, it's about a murder trial. But I also want to recommend The Thin Red Line because it's got fragmented, subjective perspectives like Rashomon of ordinary people like Bicycle Thieves who are participating in systemic violence like The Zone of Interest while raising ethical and existential questions like 12 Angry Men. Although I can't lie, the first Terrence Malick film that came to mind when I looked at your favorites was A Hidden Life because it involves Nazis like The Zone of Interest, but it also depicts a trial and one man standing up for what he believes is morally right like 12 Angry Men. I feel like a lot of my explanations are starting to sound repetitive, so I'll just say I get the feeling you'd really like Beau Travail. The combination of Bicycle Thieves and The Zone of Interest makes me think you'd like Ivan's Childhood. The Third Man doesn't have a similar structure to Rashomon, but it does involve people having conflicting accounts of what really happened, which leads to an investigation. Plus, this is a classic, and I think someone with taste as good as yours would appreciate it. Speaking of classics, one that does have a sort of similar structure to Rashomon that I think you'd enjoy is The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Since you like Bicycle Thieves, I get the feeling you might like The White Balloon, because it has a similar depiction of a child and family, and these ordinary people navigating daily struggles, mainly related to money. And like Rashomon, this movie does shift perspectives at one point, but it's only for one shot, and it happens to be the most powerful shot in the whole movie. But if you want more of that Italian neo-realism, I'm biased, but my favorite film from the director of Bicycle Thieves is Umberto D, so of course I think this one is worth checking out. And even though this one is French New Wave, not Italian neo-realism, the fact that you've got Bicycle Thieves in your favorites makes me suspect you'd enjoy The 400 Blows. The White Ribbon, like The Zone of Interest, is a fascinating examination of family, evil, and violence. The Cremator, like The Zone of Interest, explores the horrors of the Holocaust through its unique stylistic approach and atmosphere more so than its story. I've recommended Bicycle Thieves to people with Life is Beautiful in their four favorites because of the father-son dynamic, and you didn't have Life is Beautiful marked as watch, which is set during the Holocaust, like The Zone of Interest. There's a scene in The Zone of Interest of a little boy using a drum, and it could be a coincidence or it could be an homage, but the fact that they're both on the list of the best anti-fascist films of all time makes me think that was a nod onto the tin drum. I wrote down a lot of Holocaust-related movies since you like the zone of interest, but I figured I can't just recommend a bunch of Holocaust movies because that might not be what you love about this movie. But you didn't have any reviews on your Letterboxd account, so I'm just making guesses. I can't speak for anyone else, but I personally think there's something so chilling about watching people go about their lives normally in broad daylight, gardening and enjoying themselves while there's evil going on around them, whether they're aware of that evil or not. And another movie that I think does that exceptionally well is The Vanishing. But going back to the Holocaust movie thing, 3 of your favorites are considered some of the best movies ever made, and the zone of interest takes place during the Holocaust. So I feel like I have to include Schindler's List, which is considered one of the best movies ever made and takes place during the Holocaust. And you already saw most of the courtroom films I wanted to recommend since you like 12 Angry Men. The one that you didn't have marked as watched that I think you'd enjoy is Anatomy of a Murder.